Disc 9.
On hearing of Winchell's hospitalization, Governor Saltonstall had left his State House office to communicate his concern directly to Winchell, whom privately he could only have despised, and to promise a thorough investigation into the well-plotted, obviously premeditated pandemonium that, by a mere fluke, had produced no fatalities. He also assured Winchell of protection by the state police and, if need be, by the National Guard for as long as Winchell campaigned in Massachusetts. And before the governor left the hospital, he saw to it that 2 armed troopers were stationed at the door only feet from Winchell's bed. The Boston Herald interpreted Saltonstall's intervention as a political maneuver to gain him recognition as a courageous, honorable, fair-minded conservative who could serve his party as a dignified replacement in 1944 for the Democratic Vice President Burton K. Wheeler, who'd done the job required in the 1940 campaign, but whose imprudence as an orator, many Republicans now believed, might compromise their president the second time around. In a hospital press conference where Winchell appeared before the photographers in his robe, with surgical dressings half covering his face and a heavily bandaged left foot, he welcomed Governor Saltonstall's offer, but declined assistance in a message, cast now that he was under assault, in language more statesmanlike than his standard feverish patter, that was distributed to the 24 reporters from the radio and the press who had converged on his room. The statement began, "On the day when a candidate for the presidency of the United States requires a phalanx of armed police officers and National Guardsmen to protect his right to free speech, this great country will have passed over into fascist barbarism. I cannot accept that the religious intolerance emanating from the White House has already so corrupted the ordinary citizen that he has lost all respect for fellow Americans of a creed or a faith different from his own. I cannot accept that the abhorrence for my religion shared by Adolf Hitler and Charles A. Lindbergh can already have corroded." From then on, anti-Semitic agitators hunted Winchell down at every crossing, though without success in Boston, where Saltonstall had ignored Winchell's grandstanding and directed his troops to impose order, employing force if need be, and to carry the violent off to jail, a command that they undertook to execute, however reluctantly. Meanwhile, using a cane to support himself because of his burned foot, and with his jaw and forehead still bandaged, Winchell proceeded to draw an angry mob chanting, "Kike, go home," in every single parish where he displayed his stigmata to the faithful, from the Gate of Heaven Church in Dorchester to St. Gabriel's Monastery in Brighton. Beyond Massachusetts, in communities in upper New York State, in Pennsylvania, and throughout the Midwest that were already notorious for their bigotry, and to which Winchell's explosive strategy inevitably pointed him, most of the local authorities did not share Saltonstall's unwillingness to tolerate civil unrest, and so, despite the doubling of his entourage of plainclothes bodyguards, the candidate came close to getting himself mauled each time he stepped onto the soapbox to denounce the fascist in the White House and to assign responsibility directly to the president's religious hatred for fostering unheard-of Nazi barbarism in the American streets. The worst and most widespread violence occurred in Detroit, the Midwestern headquarters of the radio priest, Father Coughlin, and his Jew-hating Christian Front, and of the crowd-pleasing minister known as the Dean of Anti-Semites, Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, who preached that Christian character is the true basis of real Americanism. Detroit, of course, was also home to the American automobile industry and to Lindbergh's elderly Secretary of the Interior, Henry Ford, whose avowedly anti-Semitic newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published in the 1920s, addressed itself to an investigation of the Jewish question, which Ford ultimately reprinted in 4 volumes, totaling nearly 1,000 pages, entitled The International Jew, in which he directed that in the cleansing of America, the international Jew and his satellites, as the conscious enemies of all that Anglo-Saxons mean by civilization, are not spared. It was to be expected that organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and eminent liberal journalists like John Gunther and Dorothy Thompson would be outraged by the Detroit riots and immediately make public their disgust. But so too were many conventional middle-class Americans who, even if they found Walter Winchell and his rhetoric repugnant and understood him to be asking for trouble, were also appalled by the eyewitness reports of how the rioting that had begun at Winchell's first stop in Hamtramck, the residential section inhabited chiefly by auto workers and their families, and said to contain the world's largest Polish population outside Warsaw, had suspiciously spread within minutes to Dexter Boulevard, to Linwood, and then to 12th Street. There, in the city's biggest Jewish neighborhoods, shops were looted and windows broken, Jews trapped outdoors were set upon and beaten, and kerosene-soaked crosses were ignited on the lawns of the fancy houses along Chicago Boulevard and out front of the modest two-family dwellings of the house painters, plumbers, butchers, bakers, junk dealers, and grocers who lived on Webb and Tuxedo, and in the little dirt yards of the poorest Jews on Pingree and Euclid. In mid-afternoon, only moments before the school day ended, a firebomb was thrown into the front foyer of Winterhalter Elementary School, whose student body was 95% Jewish, another into the foyer of Central High, where more than half the students were Jewish, and another through a window at the Sholom Aleichem Institute downtown, a cultural organization Coughlin had ridiculously identified as communist, and a fourth outside another of Coughlin's communist targets, the Jewish Workers' Alliance. Next came the attack on houses of worship. Not only were windows broken and walls defaced on some half of the city's 30-odd Orthodox synagogues, but as evening services were scheduled to begin, an explosion went off on the steps of the prestigious Chicago Boulevard Temple, Shari Zedek. The explosion there caused extensive damage to the exotic centerpiece of architect Albert Kahn's Moorish design, the three massive arched doorways that conspicuously exhibited to a working-class populace a distinctively un-American style. 5 passers-by, none of whom happened to be Jews, were injured by flying debris from the facade, but no casualties were otherwise reported. By nightfall, several hundred of the city's 30,000 Jews had fled and taken refuge across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario, and American history had recorded its first large-scale pogrom, clearly modeled on the spontaneous demonstrations against Germany's Jews known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, whose atrocities had been planned and perpetrated by the Nazis 4 years earlier, and that Father Coughlin in his weekly tabloid Social Justice had defended at the time as a reaction by the Germans against Jewish-inspired communism. Detroit's Kristallnacht was similarly justified on the editorial page of the Detroit Times as the unfortunate but inevitable and altogether understandable backlash to the activities of the troublemaking interloper the paper identified as the Jewish demagogue, whose aim from the outset had been to incite the rage of patriotic Americans with his treasonous rabble-rousing. The week after the September assault on Detroit's Jews, which was addressed with dispatch by neither Michigan's governor nor the city's mayor, new violence was directed at homes, shops, and synagogues in Jewish neighborhoods in Cleveland, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and St. Louis. Violence that Winchell's enemies attributed to his deliberately challenging appearances in those cities after the cataclysm that he'd instigated in Detroit, and that Winchell himself, who, in Indianapolis, barely escaped being crushed by a paving stone hurled from a rooftop that had broken the neck of the bodyguard stationed beside him, explained by the climate of hate emanating from the White House. Our own street in Newark was many hundreds of miles from Dexter Boulevard in Detroit. Nobody around had ever been to Detroit, and before September 1942, all that the boys on the block knew about Detroit was that organized baseball's only Jewish player was the Tiger star first baseman Hank Greenberg. But then came the Winchell riots, and suddenly even the children could recite the names of the Detroit neighborhoods that had been shaken by violence. Parroting what they heard from their parents, they would argue back and forth as to whether Walter Winchell was courageous or foolish, self-sacrificing or self-serving, and whether or not he was playing right into Lindbergh's hands by allowing the Gentiles to tell themselves that the Jews had brought their misery on themselves. They argued over whether it would be better if, before Winchell set off a nationwide pogrom, he desisted and allowed normal relations to be restored between the Jews and their fellow Americans, or whether in the long run it would be better for him to continue to raise the alarm among the country's more complacent Jews and to arouse the conscience of Christians by exposing the menace of anti-Semitism from one end of America to the other. On the way to school, on the playground after school, between classes in the school corridors, you would see the smartest kids standing toe-to-toe, kids Sandy's age, as well as a few no older than me, heatedly debating whether Walter Winchell's crisscrossing the country with a soapbox to flush into the open the German-American Bundists and the Coglenites and the Ku Klux Klanners and the Silver Shirts and the America Firsters and the Black Legion and the American Nazi Party, whether getting these organized anti-Semites and their thousands of unseen sympathizers to reveal themselves for what they were and to reveal the president for what he was, a chief executive and commander-in-chief who hadn't yet bothered to acknowledge that anything like a state of emergency existed, let alone called in federal troops to prevent further rioting, was good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. After Detroit, the Jews of Newark, numbering some 50,000 in a city of well over 500,000, began to ready themselves for serious violence erupting on their own streets, either because of a Winchell visit to New Jersey when he swung back east, or because of the riots inevitably spilling over into cities where, as in Newark, there was a heavily Jewish neighborhood abutting large communities of working-class Irish, Italians, Germans, and Slavs that were already home to a goodly number of bigots. The assumption was that these people wouldn't require much encouragement to be molded into a mindless, destructive mob by the pro-Nazi conspiracy that had successfully plotted the riot in Detroit. Almost overnight, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, along with 5 other eminent Newark Jews, including Meyer Ellenstein, established the Newark Committee of Concerned Jewish Citizens. Quickly, the group became a model for similar ad hoc Jewish citizens groups in other big cities that were determined to ensure their community safety by enlisting the authorities to draw up contingency plans to prepare for the worst possibility. The Newark Committee arranged first for a City Hall meeting, presided over by Mayor Murphy, whose election had ended Ellenstein's 8-year tenure, with Newark's police chief, fire chief, and director of the Department of Public Safety. The next day, the committee met at the State House in Trenton with Democratic Governor Charles Edison, the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, and the commanding officer of the New Jersey National Guard. Attorney General Willens, an acquaintance of all 6 committee members, also attended, and in the bulletin the Newark Committee issued to the Jersey papers, he was reported to have assured Rabbi Prince that anyone attempting an assault on the Jews of Newark would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The committee next telegrammed Rabbi Bengelsdorf, requesting a meeting with him in Washington, but was informed that theirs was a local and not a federal issue, and advised to address their concern, as they were doing, to state and city officials. Partisans of Rabbi Bengelsdorf lauded him for keeping himself aloof from the sordid Walter Winchell affair while quietly, in private White House conversations with Mrs. Lindbergh, urging assistance to those innocent Jews throughout the country who were tragically paying for the iniquitous conduct of the renegade candidate, a provocateur cynically encouraging American citizens who needed in no way to feel besieged to cling to their oldest, most crippling anxieties. The Bengelsdorf supporters constituted an influential clique drawn from the highly assimilated upper echelon of German Jewish society. A good many of them had been born to wealth and were among the first Jewish generation to attend elite secondary schools and Ivy League colleges, where, because their numbers were minute, they had mingled with the non-Jews, whom they subsequently associated with in communal, political, and business endeavors, and who sometimes appeared to accept them as equals. To these privileged Jews, there was nothing suspicious about the programs designed by Rabbi Bengelsdorf's agency to assist poorer, less cultivated Jews in learning to live in closer harmony with the nation's Christians. What was unfortunate, in their opinion, was that Jews like us continued to huddle together in cities like Newark out of a xenophobia fostered by historical pressures that no longer existed. The status conferred by economic and vocational advantage inclined them to believe that those who lacked their prestige were rebuffed by the larger society more because of insular clannishness than because of any pronounced taste for exclusiveness on the part of the Christian majority, and that neighborhoods like ours were less the result of discrimination than its breeding grounds. They recognized, of course, that there were pockets of backward people in America, among whom virulent anti-Semitism was still their strongest, most obsessive passion. But that seemed only another reason for the director of the OAA to encourage Jews handicapped by the limitations of a segregated existence to at least permit their children to enter the American mainstream and show themselves there to be nothing like the caricature of the Jew disseminated by our enemies. Why these wealthy, urbane, self-assured Jews particularly abhorred the self-caricaturing Winchell was because he so deliberately reinforced the very hostility that they imagined themselves to have propitiated by their exemplary behavior toward their Christian colleagues and friends. Aside from Rabbi Prince and ex-Mayor Ellenstein, the four remaining members of the Newark Committee were the elderly civic leader responsible for the success of the Americanization programs for immigrant children in the Newark school system, and the wife of Beth Israel Hospital's leading surgeon, Jenny Danzis, the department store executive and son of the founder of S. Plout and Company, as well as 10-time president of the Broad Street Association, Moses Plout, the prominent city property owner and past president of the Newark Conference of Jewish Charities, community leader Michael Stavitsky, and the chief of Beth Israel's medical staff, Dr. Eugene Parsonet. That Newark's leading mobster, Longy's Willman, hadn't been enlisted to join a group of local Jews as distinguished as this was no surprise to anyone, even though Longy was a wealthy man of enormous influence and hardly less distressed than Rabbi Prince by the menace posed by the anti-Semites who, under the pretext of being provoked by Walter Winchell, had ushered in what looked to many like stage one of the resolution of Henry Ford's Jewish question. Longy set out separately, apart from the many civil authorities who had promised Rabbi Prince their fullest cooperation to ensure that if and when the Newark cops and the New Jersey state troopers failed to respond any more vigorously than the police had to the disorder in Boston and Detroit, the city's Jews would not be left unprotected. Bullet Apfelbaum, the close associate known throughout the city as Longy's chief enforcer, and the older brother of Niggy Apfelbaum, was assigned by Longy to supplement the good work of the Newark Committee of Concerned Jewish Citizens by recruiting that scattering of incorrigible Jewish kids who had failed to graduate from high school and training them as cadre for a hastily assembled volunteer corps to be called the Provisional Jewish Police. These were the local boys without any of the ideals that were embedded in the rest of us, who'd already begun to emanate an aura of lawlessness as far back as the 5th grade, inflating condoms in the school toilet, and breaking into fistfights on the 14 bus and wrestling till they bled onto the concrete sidewalk outside the movies, the ones who, during their years in school, parents directed their children to have nothing to do with, and who were now in their 20s and occupied running numbers and shooting pool and washing dishes in the kitchens of one or another of the neighborhood's delicatessen restaurants. To most of us, they were known, if at all, only by the hoodlum magic of their supercharged nicknames: Leo the Lion Nussbaum, Knuckles Kimmelman, Big Jerry Schwartz, Dummy Breitbart, Duke It Out Glick, and by their double-digit IQ scores. And now they were stationed on every second street corner, our neighborhood's handful of flops, spitting expertly into the gutter from between their teeth and signaling back and forth by whistling with their fingers angled deep in their mouths. Here they were, the callous and the obtuse and the mentally deficient, the Jews' very own deviants, strolling the streets like sailors on shore leave, looking for a fight. Here they were, the brainless few we had been raised to pity and fear, the Stone Age oafs, and the seething runts and ominous, swaggering weightlifters, buttonholing kids like me out on Chancellor Avenue, and telling us to keep our baseball bats at the ready, in case we were called in the night to take to the streets, and going around to the Y in the evenings and to the ball fields on Sundays, and to the local stores during the week, shanghaiing the able-bodied from among the neighborhood's grown men so as to bring to a total of 3 on each block, a squad they could count on in an emergency. They embodied everything crude and despicable that our parents had hoped to leave behind, along with their childhood pennilessness in the Third Ward slums. And yet here were our demons got up as our guardians, each with a loaded revolver strapped to his calf, a gun on loan from the collection of Bullet Apfelbaum, who was known by everyone to have devoted his existence to loyally intimidating folks on Longie's behalf, threatening them, beating them, torturing them, and despite the fact that, in imitation of a boss easily 30 pounds leaner and a foot taller, Bullet was never to be seen other than in a three-piece suit adorned with a neatly folded silk pocket handkerchief the color of his tie, and wearing an expensive Borsalino debonairly angled only inches above what was admittedly the ungenerous glower of an extremely severe judge of human nature, ending their lives for them, should that be the boss's pleasure. What made the death of Walter Winchell worthy of instantaneous nationwide coverage wasn't only that his unorthodox campaign had touched off the century's worst anti-Semitic rioting outside Nazi Germany, but that the murder of a mere candidate for the presidency was unprecedented in America. Though Presidents Lincoln and Garfield had been shot and killed in the second half of the 19th century, and McKinley at the start of the 20th, and though in 1933, FDR had survived an assassination attempt that had instead taken the life of his Democratic supporter, Chicago's Mayor Cermak, it wasn't until 26 years after Winchell's assassination that a second presidential candidate would be gunned down. That was New York's Democratic Senator Robert Kennedy, fatally shot in the head after winning his party's California primary on Tuesday, June 4th, 1968. On Monday, October 5th, 1942, I was home alone after school listening on our living room radio to the final innings of the fifth game of the World Series between the Cardinals and the Yankees, when, in the top of the ninth, with the Cardinals coming to bat in a 2-2 tie and leading the series 3-1, the play-by-play broadcast was halted by a voice with that finely articulated, faintly anglicized diction prized in a network news announcer back in radio's earlier days. We interrupt this program to bring you an important bulletin. Presidential candidate Walter Winchell has been shot and killed. We repeat, Walter Winchell is dead. He has been assassinated in Louisville, Kentucky, while addressing an open-air political rally. That is all that is known at this time of the Louisville assassination of Democratic presidential candidate Walter Winchell. We return to our regularly scheduled program. It wasn't quite 5 p.m. My father had just left for the market in Uncle Monty's truck. My mother had gone out to Chancellor Avenue a few minutes earlier to buy something for dinner, and my single-minded brother was off in search of a trysting place to resume importuning one of his after-school girls to grant him access to her chest. I had heard shouting in the street, then a scream from a nearby house, but the game had come back on, and the suspense was tremendous. Red Ruffing pitching to the Cardinals' rookie third baseman, Whitey Kurowski, Cardinals catcher Walker Cooper on first base with his 6th hit in 5 games, and the Cardinals needing only this victory to take the series. Rizzuto had homered for the Yankees. The portentously surnamed Enos Slaughter had homered for the Cardinals, and, as histrionic little fans like to tell one another, I knew, before Ruffing had even fired his first pitch, that Kurowski was about to hit a second Cardinal home run and give the Cards their 4th straight victory after an opening day loss. I couldn't wait to run outside crying, I knew it! I called it! Kurowski was due! But when Kurowski homered and the game was over and I was out the door and headed at top speed down our alleyway, I saw 2 members of the Jewish police, Big Jerry and Duke Glick, running from one side of the street to the other to bang on doors and shout into hallways, "They shot Winchell. Winchell is dead." Meanwhile, more kids were rushing out of their houses, delirious with World Series excitement. But no sooner did they hit the street howling Kurowski's name than Big Jerry began barking at them, "Go get your bats, the war is on." And he didn't mean the war against Germany. By evening, there wasn't a Jewish family on our street that wasn't barricaded behind double-locked doors, their radios playing non-stop to catch the latest bulletin and everyone phoning to tell everyone else that Winchell had said nothing remotely inflammatory to the Louisville crowd, that he had, in fact, begun his speech in what could only have been intended as an open appeal to civic self-esteem. Mr. and Mrs. Louisville, Kentucky, proud citizens of the unique American city that is home to the greatest horse race in the world and birthplace of the very first Jewish justice of the United States Supreme Court. And yet, before he could speak aloud the name of Louis D. Brandeis, he'd been brought down by 3 bullets to the back of the head. A second report, aired just moments later, identified the spot where the murder occurred as only a few yards from one of the most elegant municipal buildings constructed in the Greek Revival style in the whole of Kentucky, the Jefferson County Courthouse, with its commanding statue of Thomas Jefferson facing the street and a long, wide staircase leading up to the grandly columned portico. The shots that killed Winchell appeared to have been fired from one of the courthouse's large, austere, beautifully proportioned front windows. My mother began making her first calls immediately upon coming in from shopping. I had stationed myself just inside the door to tell her about Walter Winchell the instant she got home, but by then she already knew the little there was to be known. First, because the butcher's wife had phoned the store to repeat the news bulletin to her husband just as he was wrapping my mother's order, and then because of the bewilderment apparent among the people out on the street, who were already scurrying for the safety of their homes. Failing to reach my father, whose truck hadn't yet pulled up at the market, she of course began to worry about my brother, who was cutting it close once again, and probably wouldn't come rushing up the back stairs until seconds before he was due at the kitchen table, with his hands washed of the day's dirt and his face scrubbed clean of lipstick. It was the worst moment imaginable for either of them to be away and their precise whereabouts unknown. But without taking time to unbag the groceries or to register her alarm, my mother said to me, "Get me the map. Get your map of America." There was a large folding map of the North American continent, squared away in a pocket inside Volume 1 of the encyclopedia set sold to us by a door-to-door salesman the year I started school. I rushed into the sun parlor, where, shelved between the brass George Washington bookends bought at Mount Vernon by my father, was the whole of our library. The 6-volume encyclopedia, a leather-bound copy of the United States Constitution awarded by Metropolitan Life, and the unabridged Webster's Dictionary that Aunt Evelyn had given Sandy for his 10th birthday. I opened the map and spread it across the kitchen table's oilcloth covering, whereupon my mother, using the magnifying glass that I'd received from my parents for a 7th birthday gift, along with my irreplaceable, unforgotten stamp album, searched for the speck in north-central Kentucky that was the city of Danville. In only seconds, the two of us were back at the telephone table in the foyer, above which hung yet another of my father's awards for selling insurance, a framed copper engraving replicating the Declaration of Independence. Local dial service within Essex County was barely 10 years old, and probably a good third of the people in Newark didn't as yet have any phone service at all, and most who did were, like us, on a party line. And so the long-distance call was still a wondrous phenomenon, not only because making one was far from an ordinary household experience for a family of our means, but because no technological explanation, however basic, could remove it entirely from the realm of magic. My mother spoke to the operator very precisely to be sure that nothing went wrong and we weren't charged by mistake for anything extra. "I want to make a long-distance person-to-person call, operator, to Danville, Kentucky, person-to-person to Mrs. Selma Wishnow. And please, operator, when my 3 minutes are up, don't forget to tell me." There was a long pause while the operator got the number from the directory operator. When my mother finally heard the call being placed, she signaled for me to put my ear beside hers, but not to speak. "Hello?" Answering enthusiastically is Selden. Operator: "This is long distance. I have a person-to-person call for Mrs. Selma Wistful." "Uh-huh," Selden mumbles. "Is this Mrs. Wistful?" "Hello? My mother's not home right now." Operator: "I'm calling for Mrs. Selma Wistful." "Wish now," my mother shouts. "Wish now." "Who's that?" Selden says. "Who's calling?" Operator: "Young lady, is your mother home?" "I'm a boy," Selden says. Taken aback, another blow. They won't stop coming. Yet he does sound girlish, his voice higher-pitched even than when he'd been living downstairs. "My mother's not home from work yet," Selden says. Operator: "Mrs. Wishnow is not at home, madam." My mother looks at me and says, "What could have happened? The boy is alone. Where could she be? He's all by himself." "Operator, I'll talk to anyone." Operator: "Go ahead, sir." "Who's this?" Selden asked. Selden, it's Mrs. Roth from Newark. Mrs. Roth? Yes. I'm calling long distance to speak to your mother. From Newark? You know who I am. But it sounds like you're just down the street. Well, I'm not. This is a long-distance call. Selden, where's your mother? I'm just having a snack. I'm waiting for her to come home from work. I'm having some fig Newtons and some milk. Selden, I'm waiting for her to come home from work. She works late. She always works late. I just sit here. Sometimes I have a snack. Selden, stop right there. Be still a moment. But then she comes home and she makes dinner. But she's late every night. Here, my mother turns to me and makes to hand me the phone. Talk to him. He won't listen when I speak. Talk to him about what? I say, waving the phone away. Is Philip there? Selden asks. Just a moment, Selden, my mother says. Is Philip there? Selden repeats. To me, my mother says, take the phone, please. But what am I supposed to say? I ask. Just get on the phone, and she places the receiver in my one hand and lifts the speaker for me to hold in the other. Hello, Selden, I say. Softly tentative, unbelieving, he replies, Philip? Yes, hi, Selden. Hey, you know, I don't have any friends in school. I tell him, we want to speak to your mother. My mother's at work. She works late every night. I'm having a snack. I'm having some fig Newtons and a glass of milk. It's going to be my birthday in about a week, and my mother said I could have a party. Selden. Wait a minute. But I don't have any friends. Selden, I have to ask my mother a question. Just wait. I muzzle the speaker and whisper to her. What am I supposed to say to him? My mother whispers, ask him if he knows what happened today in Louisville. Selden, my mother wants to know if you know what happened today in Louisville. I live in Danville. Kentucky. I'm just waiting for my mom to come home. I'm having a snack. Did something happen in Louisville? Just a minute, Selden, I say. Now what? I whisper to my mother. Just talk to him, please. Keep talking to him. And if the operator says the 3 minutes are up, you tell me. Why are you calling? Selden asked. Are you going to come visit? No. Remember when I saved your life? He says. Yes, I do. I remember. Hey, what time is it there? Are you in Newark? Are you on Summit Avenue? We told you we were, yes. It's really clear, isn't it? It sounds like you're just down the block. I wish you could come over and have a snack with me, and then you could be here for my birthday party next week. I don't have any friends to invite to my birthday party. I don't have anybody to play chess with. I'm sitting here now practicing my opening move. Remember my opening move? I move out the pawn that's just in front of the king. Remember when I try to teach you? I move out the king's pawn, remember? Then I put out the bishop, then I move the knight, and then the other knight, and remember the move when there's no pieces between the king and one of the rooks? When I move my king over 2 spaces to protect him? Selden. My mother whispers, tell him you miss him. Ma, I say to her, tell him, Philip. I miss you, Selden. Do you want to come over for a snack, then? I mean, it sounds like... Are you really just down the street? No, this is a long-distance phone call. What time is it there? It's, about 10 to 6. Oh, it's 10 to 6 here. My mom should already be home around 5:30 the latest. One night she came home at 9. Selden, I say, do you know that Walter Winchell was killed? Who's that? He asks. Let me finish. Walter Winchell was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, in your state, today. I'm sorry to hear that. Who is that? Operator. Your 3 minutes are up, sir. Is that your uncle? Selden asks. Is that your uncle who came to see you? Is he dead? No, I say, and I'm thinking that, alone now out in Kentucky, he sounds as though he were the one who was kicked in the head. He sounds stunned, stunted. He sounds stopped. And yet he was the smartest kid in our class. My mother takes the phone. Selden, this is Mrs. Roth. I want you to write something down. Okay, I have to go find a piece of paper and a pencil. Waiting. Selden, my mother says. More waiting. Okay, he says. Selden, write this down. This is now costing a lot of money. I'm sorry, Mrs. Roth. I just couldn't find a pencil in the house. I was at the kitchen table. I was having a snack. Selden, write down that Mrs. Roth, okay, called from Newark. From Newark. Gosh, I wish I was still in Newark, living downstairs. You know, I saved Philip's life. Mrs. Roth called from Newark to be sure, just a minute, I'm writing, to be sure everything is okay. Is something supposed to not be okay? I mean, Philip's all right. And you're okay. Is Mr. Roth okay? Yes, thank you for asking, Selden. Tell your mother that's why I called. There's nothing to worry about here. Should I be worried about something? No, just eat your snack. I think I've had enough Fig Newtons now, but thanks anyway. Goodbye, Selden. I like Fig Newtons, though. Goodbye, Selden. Mrs. Roth? Yes? Is Philip going to come visit me? It's my birthday next week, and I don't have anybody to invite for my birthday party. I don't have any friends in Danville. The kids here call me Saltine. I have to play chess with a kid who's 6 years old. He lives next door. He's the only one I can play with. One kid. I taught him chess. Sometimes he makes moves you can't do, or he moves his queen and I have to tell him not to. I win all the time, but it's really no fun. But I have nobody else to play with. Selden, it's hard for everyone. It's hard for everyone now. Goodbye, Selden. And she placed the receiver onto the hook and began to sob. Only days before, on October 1st, the 2 Summit Avenue flats vacated in September by the homesteaders of 42, the one beneath ours and another across the street, 3 floors down, were occupied by Italian families up from the First Ward. Essentially, their new living quarters had been assigned to them by outright government edict, though with the sweetening incentive of a rent discount of 15%, or $6.37 on their monthly $42.50, over a 5-year period. That money to be paid directly to the landlord by the Department of the Interior over the life of the initial 3-year lease and for the first 2 years of a lease's 3-year renewal. Such arrangements derived from a previously unpublicized section of the homesteading plan called the Good Neighbor Project, designed to introduce a steadily increasing number of non-Jewish residents into predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, and in this way enrich the Americanness of everyone involved. What one heard at home, however, and sometimes even at school from our teachers, was that the underlying goal of the Good Neighbor Project, like that of Just Folks, was to weaken the solidarity of the Jewish social structure, as well as to diminish whatever electoral strength a Jewish community might have in local and congressional elections. If the displacing of Jewish families and their replacement by the conscripting of Gentile families followed the timetable of the agency's master plan, a Christian majority might well be dominant in at least half of America's 20 most heavily populated Jewish neighborhoods as early as the start of Lindbergh's second term and a resolution of America's Jewish question close at hand, by one means or another. The family conscripted to move in downstairs from us, a mother, a father, a son, and a grandmother, were the accuses. Because of my father's years of canvassing the First Ward, where the customers whose tiny premiums he collected each month were by and large Italians, he was already familiar with the new tenants, and consequently, when he got home from work on the morning after Mr. Kakuza, a night watchman, had trucked the family's possessions up from their cold water flat in a tenement building on a side street not far from Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, my father stopped off first at the downstairs door to see if, despite his appearing there without a coat and tie and with dirty hands, the elderly grandmother would recognize him as the insurance man who'd sold her husband the policy that had provided the family with the means to bury him. The other Kakuses, relatives of our Kakuses, who'd moved from their own First Ward cold water flat to the house 3 doors away, were a much larger family. 3 sons, a daughter, the 2 parents, and a grandfather, and potentially noisier, more disruptive neighbors. They were associated through the grandfather and the father with Richie the Boot Boiato, the mobster who ruled Newark's Italian precincts and constituted the city's only serious competitor to Longhi's underworld monopoly. To be sure, the father, Tommy, was but one of a bevy of underlings and, like his own retired father, doubled as a waiter at Boiato's popular restaurant, the Vittorio Castle, when he wasn't making the rounds of the taverns, barbershops, brothels, schoolyards, and candy stores of the Third Ward slums to extract their pocket change from the Negroes who faithfully played the daily numbers game. Regardless of religion, the other Cacuses were hardly the sort of neighbors my parents wanted anywhere near their impressionable young sons. And to comfort us at breakfast on Sunday morning, my father explained how much worse off we would have been if we'd gotten the numbers runner and his 3 boys instead of the night watchman and his son Joey, an 11-year-old recently enrolled at St. Peter's and, by my father's report, a good-natured kid with a hearing problem who had little in common with his roughneck cousins. Whereas down in the First Ward, all 4 of Tommy Cacuse's kids had gone to the local public school, here they'd been enrolled along with Joey at St. Peter's, rather than at a public school like ours, brimming with brainy little Jews. Since my father had left work only a few hours after the Winchell assassination and, over Uncle Monty's angry objections, driven back home to spend the remainder of that tense evening beside his wife and his children, the 4 of us were seated together at the kitchen table, waiting for the radio to bring fresh news, when Mr. Cacuse and Joey came up the back stairway to pay a visit. They knocked on the door, and then had to wait on the landing until my father was sure who was there. Mr. Cacuse was a bald, hulking man 6.5 feet tall, weighing over 250 pounds, and he was dressed for work in his night watchman's uniform, a dark blue shirt, freshly pressed dark blue trousers, and a wide black belt that, along with holding up his trousers, supported several pounds of the most extraordinary collection of equipment I'd ever been close enough to reach out and touch. There were keys in bunches, each the size of a hand grenade, hanging to the side of either pants pocket. There was a set of real handcuffs, and a night watchman's clock in its black case dangled by a strap from the polished belt buckle. At first glance, I took the clock for a bomb, but there was no mistaking for other than what it was, the pistol in a holster at his waist. A longish flashlight that had to have doubled as a blackjack was stuck, lamp upward, into his back pocket, and high on one sleeve of his starched work shirt was a triangular white patch whose blue lettering read, Special Guard. Joey was also big, only 2 years my senior and already twice my weight, and to me the equipment he sported was nearly as intriguing as his father's. Looking like a wad of molded bubble gum plugging the hole in his right ear was a hearing aid attached by a thin wire to a round black case with a dial on the front that he wore clipped to his shirt pocket. Another wire attached to a battery about the size of a large cigarette lighter that he carried around in his pants pocket. And in his hands, he carried a cake, a gift from his mother to mine. Joey's gift was the cake. Mr. Cacuse's was a pistol. He owned 2, one that he wore for work, and the other that he kept hidden away at home. He'd come to offer my father the spare. "Nice of you," my father said to him, "but I really don't know how to shoot. You pull the trig." Mr. Cacuse had a surprisingly soft voice for someone so enormous, though with a raspy edge to it, as if it had been exposed too long to the weather during his hours of walking the watchman's beat, and his accent was so enjoyable to hear that when I was alone, I sometimes pretended that the way he talked was the way I talked too. How many times did I entertain myself by saying aloud, "You pull the trig"? With the exception of Joey's American-born mother, our Cacuses all had oddish voices, the bewhiskered grandmothers being oddest of all. Odder even than Joey's, which sounded less like a voice than like the uninflected echo of a voice. And odd, not just because she went around speaking only Italian, whether to others, including me, or to herself while she swept the back stairway, or kneeled in the dirt planting her vegetables in our minute backyard, or just stood muttering in the dark doorway. Hers was the oddest because it sounded like a man's. She looked like a tiny old man in a long black dress, and she sounded like one too, particularly when barking the commands and decrees and injunctions that Joey never dared disobey. The playful half of him, the soul that the nuns and the priests never saw enough of to save, was virtually all that I ever encountered when we 2 were alone. Why it was hard to feel too sorry about his hearing was because Joey was himself a very jolly, prankish boy with his own brand of hooting laughter, a talkative, curious, monumentally gullible boy whose mind moved quickly if unpredictably. It was hard to feel sorry for him, yet when he was around his family, Joey's obedience was so painstakingly thorough that I found it almost as astonishing to contemplate as the painstakingly thorough lawlessness of a Shushy Margulis. There couldn't have been a better son in all of Italian Newark, which was why my own mother soon found him irresistible. His faultless filial devotion and his long, dark eyelashes, the way he imploringly looked at adults waiting to be told what to do, allowed her to set aside the uneasy aloofness that was her inbuilt defense against Gentiles. The old country grandmother, however, gave her and me the willies. "You aim," Mr. Kakuza explained to my father, using a finger and a thumb to demonstrate. "And you shoot. You aim, and you shoot, and that's it." "I don't need it," my father said. "But if it ain't come round," Mr. Kakuza said, "how you gonna protect?" Kakuza. "I was born in the city of Newark in the year 1901, my father told him. All my life I have paid my rent on time, I have paid my taxes on time, and I have paid my bills on time. I've never cheated on an employer for as much as a dime. I have never tried to cheat the United States government. I believe in this country. I love this country." "Me too," said our massive new downstairs neighbor, whose wide black belt might have been hung with shrunken heads, given the enchantment that it continued to cast over me. "I come here, I was at 10. Best country any place, no Mussolini here." "I'm glad you feel that way, Kakuza. It's a tragedy for Italy. It's a human tragedy for people like you. Mussolini, Hitler, making me sick." "You know what I love, Kakuza?" "Election day," my father told him. "I love to vote. Since I was old enough, I have not missed an election. In 1924, I voted against Mr. Coolidge and for Mr. Davis, and Mr. Coolidge won. And we all know what Mr. Coolidge did for the poor people of this country. In 1928, I voted against Mr. Hoover and for Mr. Smith, and Mr. Hoover won. And we know what he did for the poor people of this country. In 1932, I voted against Mr. Hoover for the second time, and for Mr. Roosevelt for the first time, and thank God Mr. Roosevelt won, and he put America back on its feet. He took this country out of the Depression, and he gave the people what he promised, a new deal. In 1936, I voted against Mr. Landon and for Mr. Roosevelt, and again, Mr. Roosevelt won. 2 states, Maine and Vermont. That is all Mr. Landon is able to carry. Can't even carry Kansas. Mr. Roosevelt sweeps the country by the biggest presidential vote there has ever been, and once again, he keeps every promise to the working people that he made in that campaign. And so, what do the voters up and do in 1940? They elect a fascist instead. Not just an idiot like Coolidge, not just a fool like Hoover, but an out-and-out fascist with a medal to prove it. They put in a fascist and a fascist rabble-rouser, Mr. Wheeler, as his sidekick, and they put Mr. Ford into the cabinet, not only an anti-Semite right up there with Hitler, but a slave driver who has turned the working man into a human machine. And so tonight, you come to me, sir, in my own home, and you offer me a pistol. In America, in the year 1942, a brand new neighbor, a man I do not even know yet, has to come here and offer me a pistol in order for me to protect my family from Mr. Lindbergh's anti-Semitic mob. Well, don't you think I'm not grateful, Kakuza? I will never forget your concern. But I am a citizen of the United States of America, and so is my wife, and so are my children, and so, he said, his voice catching, and so was Mr. Walter Winchell. But now, suddenly, there is a radio bulletin about Walter Winchell. Shh, my father says, shh, as though in the kitchen someone other than himself had been the orator holding forth. We all listen. Even Joey appears to listen, the way birds flock to migrate and fish swim in a school. The body of Walter Winchell, slain that day at a political rally in Louisville, Kentucky, by a suspected American Nazi Party assassin working in collaboration with the Ku Klux Klan, will be carried overnight by train from Louisville to Pennsylvania Station in New York City. There, by order of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and under the protection of the New York City Police, the body will lie in state in the Great Hall of the train station throughout the morning. According to Jewish custom, a funeral service will be held that same day at 2 p.m. in Temple Emmanuel, New York's largest synagogue. A public address system will broadcast the proceedings beyond the temple to a gathering of mourners on Fifth Avenue expected to number in the tens of thousands. Along with Mayor LaGuardia, speakers will include Democratic Senator James Meade, New York's Jewish Governor Herbert Lehman, and the former President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. "It's happening," my father cries. "He's back. FDR is back." "We need him bad," Mr. Kakuza says. "Boys," he asks, "do you understand what is happening?" And here he throws his arms around Sandy and me. "It's the beginning of the end of fascism in America. No Mussolini here, Kakuza. No more Mussolini here." Chapter 8. October 1942. Bad Days. Alvin appeared at our house the next night, driving a brand-new green Buick with a fiancée named Minna Shap. Fiancée always got me when I heard the word spoken as a kid. It made whoever she was sound like somebody special. Then she showed up, and she was just some girl who, when she met the family, was afraid to say the wrong thing. The special one here wasn't the intended wife anyway, but the intended father-in-law, a masterful deal-maker, prepared to deliver Alvin from the game machine business, where, assisted by two strong-armed thugs who lifted the freight and fended off evildoers, my cousin was employed trucking and setting up the illegal machines, and into a hand-tailored Hong Kong silk suit and a white-on-white monogrammed shirt as an Atlantic City restaurateur. Though Mr. Shap had himself started out in the 20s as Pinball Billy Shapiro, a two-bit hustler associated with the worst hoods from the most run-down row houses on the most violent streets of the South Philly Badlands, among them the uncle of Shushi Margulis, by 1942, the return on the pinballs and the slots amounted to upward of $15,000 unreported dollars each week. And Pinball Billy had been regenerated as William F. Shap II, highly esteemed member of the Green Valley Country Club of the Jewish fraternal organization Brit Achim, where on Saturday nights he took his dynamic wife and her gigantic jewels to dance to the music of Jackie Jacobs and his Jolly Jazzes and of Har Zion Synagogue, through whose burial society he purchased a family plot in a beautifully landscaped corner of the synagogue cemetery, as well as the Maharaja of an 18-room mansion in suburban Marion and wintertime occupant of a poor boy's dream of a penthouse suite annually reserved for him at the Miami Beach Eden Rock. At 31, Minna was 8 years Alvin's senior, a buttery complexioned woman with a brow-beaten look who, when she even dared to speak in her babyish voice, enunciated each word as though she had only just learned to tell time. She was every inch the child of overbearing parents, but because her father owned, in addition to the Intercity Carding Company, the public face of the gaming machine operation, half an acre of Lobster House, across from the steel pier where people lined up twice around the block to get in on weekends, and because back in the early 30s, when Prohibition ended and Pinball Billy's lucrative side interest in Waxy Gordon's interstate bootlegging syndicate suddenly dried up, he'd established Philadelphia's original Shaps, the steakhouse popular with what in Philly they called the Jew Mob. Pinball Billy figured strongly with Alvin as Minna's advocate. "The contract goes like this," Shap told him when he handed Alvin the cash to buy his daughter's engagement ring. "Minna takes care of your leg, you take care of Minna, and I take care of you." That's how my cousin came to don the hand-tailored suits and to arrogate to himself the glamorous responsibility for ushering to their tables big-name customers such as Jersey City's crooked mayor Frank Hague, New Jersey's light heavyweight champion Gus Lesnovich, and the racket tycoons like Cleveland's Mo Dalitz, Boston's King Solomon, LA's Mickey Cohen, and even the brain himself, Meyer Lansky, when they were in town for a gangland convention. And regularly, every September, to welcome fresh from her pageant triumph the newly crowned Miss America with all her befuddled relatives in tow. Once everyone was lavishly complimented and into their silly lobster bibs, it was Alvin's pleasure to signal to the waiter, by a snap of his fingers, that the house would pick up the tab. Pinball Billy's one-legged son-in-law soon gained a nickname of his own, Showy, bestowed on him, as Alvin told everyone, by Ali Stoltz, the contender for the world lightweight title. Alvin was up from Philly to visit with Stoltz, like Gus Lesnovich, a Newark boy, the day he and Minna wound up at our house for dinner. Stoltz had fought and lost a 15-round decision against the lightweight champion in Madison Square Garden the previous May, and was training that fall at Marcillo's Market Street Gym for a November fight against Bo Jack that would gain him a shot at Tippy Larkin if he won. Once Allie gets past Bojack, Alvin said, there's just Larkin between him and the title, and Larkin's got a glass jaw. Glass jaw. Phony baloney. A going over. A hard guy. What's his beef? I'll take the grunt. The oldest dodge in the world. Alvin had a new vocabulary and a whole new ostentatious way of talking that it clearly pained my parents to hear. Yet when he said adoringly of Stoltz's generosity, Allie's a guy who is rapid with the dollar, I couldn't wait to sound like a hard guy myself by repeating the amazing expression at school along with the extensive medley of slang that Alvin now used just for the word money. Minna was silent during the meal, though my mother tried mightily to draw her out. I was overcome by shyness, and my father could think of nothing but the synagogue bombing that had taken place in Cincinnati the previous night and the looting of Jewish-owned stores in American cities scattered across 2 time zones. This was the second night in a row that he walked out on Uncle Monty rather than leave the family alone on Summit Avenue. But he couldn't worry about his brother's wrath at a time like this, and instead, all through dinner, kept getting up to go into the living room to turn on the radio and hear what news there was in the aftermath of the Winchell funeral. Alvin, meanwhile, was able to talk only about Allie and his quest for the world boxing crown as though the lightweight contender native to Newark embodied Alvin's profoundest conception of the human race. Could the abandonment have been any more complete of the moral code that had cost him his leg? He had disposed of whatever once stood between him and the aspirations of a Shushi Margulis. He had disposed of us. I wondered when I met her if Alvin had even told Minna that he was an amputee. It didn't occur to me that her subjugated personality was precisely what made her the first and only woman Alvin could tell. Nor did I understand that Minna was the evidence of his incapacity with women. His stump, in fact, constituted Alvin's greatest success with Minna, particularly after Shap died in 1960 and Minna's worthless brother took over the slots, while Alvin was content just to acquire the restaurants and to begin running with the best-looking hookers in 2 states. Whenever the stump cracked and got sore and bloody and infected, which it did as a result of his many follies, Minna immediately stepped in and wouldn't allow him to wear his prosthesis. Alvin would say to her, "For Christ's sakes, don't worry about it. It will be all right." But here alone, Minna prevailed. "You can't put a load on that leg," she'd tell him, "till you get it fixed." Meaning the artificial leg, which was always, in the leg-maker's phrase that Alvin had taught to me back when I, not yet 9, was the mothering Minna, losing its fit. When Alvin got older and his stump broke down all the time from bearing all the weight he'd gained, when he had to be without the prosthesis for weeks on end until it healed, Minna would drive him to the public beach in the summertime and watch fully clothed from under a big umbrella while he played for hours in the all-healing surf, bobbing in the waves and floating on his back and spouting saltwater geysers into the air, and then to throw a scare into the tourists crowding the beach, emerging from the water screaming, "Shark! Shark!" while pointing in horror at his stump. Alvin showed up with Minna for dinner after phoning that morning to tell my mother that he was going to be in North Jersey and wanted to stop by to thank his aunt and uncle for all they had done for him when he'd come home from the commandos and given everyone a hard time. He had a lot to be grateful for, he said, and he wanted to make peace with the 2 of them and to see the 2 boys and to introduce his fiancée. That's what he said, and that may even have been what he had in mind before he came face to face with my father and the memory of my father's reforming instincts and the fact of their innate antipathy, the antipathy as human types that were really there from the start. And it was why, when I got home from school and heard the news, I dug down into my drawer and found his medal and, for the first time since he left for Philly, pinned it back on my undershirt. Of course, it was hardly an ideal day for a conciliatory visit from the family's black sheep. There'd been no anti-Semitic violence reported in Newark or in the other major New Jersey cities during the night, but the firebombing of the synagogue that subsequently burned to the ground some 100 miles up the Ohio River from Louisville in Cincinnati, and the random window smashing and looting of Jewish-owned stores in 8 other cities, St. Louis, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh, the 3 largest, did nothing to diminish fear that the spectacle of Walter Winchell's Jewish funeral just across the Hudson in New York and the demonstrations and counter-demonstrations coinciding with all the solemn observances could easily provoke an outbreak of violence a lot closer to home. At school, first thing in the morning, a special half-hour assembly program had been called for grades 4 through 8. Along with a representative from the Board of Education, a deputy from Mayor Murphy's office, and the current president of the PTA, the principal spelled out the measures being taken to ensure our safety during the day and offered 10 rules that would protect us from harm on our way to and from school. While no mention was made of Bullet Applebaum's Jewish police, who'd been on the street all night long and were still there in the morning, drinking hot coffee out of thermoses and eating powdered donuts donated by Leroff's Bakery when Sandy and I started off for school, we were assured by the mayor's deputy that, until normal conditions are restored, extra details of city police would be patrolling the neighborhood, and we were instructed not to be alarmed if we found a uniformed policeman stationed at each of the school doors and a policeman in the corridors. 2 mimeograph sheets were then distributed to every pupil. One, listing the rules to obey on the street, which our teachers would go over with us when we returned to our homerooms, and the other to take to our parents to advise them of the new safety procedures. If there were questions, our parents should direct them to Mrs. Sisselman, the PTA president who'd succeeded my mother. We ate in the dining room, where we last had a meal when Aunt Evelyn had brought Rabbi Bengelsdorf to meet us. After Alvin's call, my mother, whose inability to hold a personal grudge Alvin would have known he could count on the moment he heard her answer the phone, went off to buy food for a dinner that would especially please him. And this, despite the anxiety aroused in her each time she had to unlock the door and go back out on the street. That armed Newark cops were now walking the beat and cruising the local streets in squad cars gave her only slightly more assurance than did the glimpses of Bullet Applebaum's Jewish police, and so, like anyone else shopping in a city under siege, she wound up all but running back and forth to Chancellor Avenue to pick up everything she needed. In the kitchen, she proceeded to bake the chocolate layer cake with chocolate icing and chopped walnuts that had been Alvin's favorite, and to peel the potatoes and chop the onions for the latkes that Alvin could devour by the batch. And the house still smelled of the baking and frying and broiling that had been touched off by the unexpected homecoming when Alvin drove his new Buick into the alleyway. There, where we'd run pass plays together with the football I stole, Alvin pulled up behind the little Ford pickup that Mr. Cucuzzi used to move people's furniture as a second job, and that happened to be parked in the garage because it was the night watchman's day off, and on his day off, he slept round the clock. Alvin arrived wearing a pearl-gray sharkskin suit, padded heavily at the shoulders, perforated two-tone wingtip shoes with taps on the toes, and bearing gifts for all. Aunt Bess's was a white apron decorated with red roses, Sandy's a sketch pad, mine a Phillies cap, and Uncle Herman's a certificate entitling a family of 4 to a free lobster dinner at the Atlantic City restaurant. His giving us all presents reassured me that just because he'd run off to Philadelphia, he hadn't forgotten all the good stuff he'd found in our house in the years preceding his losing his leg. It certainly did not look then and there as though we were a divided family, or that when dinner was over, and Minna already in the kitchen taking a lesson in latke making from her new aunt, a battle royale could possibly break out between my father and Alvin. Perhaps, if Alvin hadn't shown up in his flashy clothes and his snazzy car, all but seething with the raw carnality of Marsillo's gym and exuberant with the imminent acquisition of undreamed-of wealth, perhaps, if Winchell hadn't been assassinated 24 hours earlier and the worst that had been feared when Lindbergh first took office hadn't seemed closer to befalling us than ever before, perhaps then the 2 grown men who mattered most to me throughout my childhood might never have come so close to murdering each other. Before that night, I had no idea my father was so well suited for wreaking havoc, or equipped to make that lightning-quick transformation from sanity to lunacy that is indispensable in enacting the unbridled urge to destroy. Unlike Uncle Monty, he preferred never to speak of the ordeal of a Jewish tenement kid on Runyon Street before World War I, when the Irish, armed with sticks and rocks and iron pipes, regularly came streaming up through the viaduct underpasses of the ironbound section, seeking vengeance against the Christ killers of the Jewish Third Ward. And much as he enjoyed taking Sandy and me, to Laurel Garden on Springfield Avenue when tickets to a good match came his way, men fighting each other outside a boxing ring appalled him. That he'd always had a muscular physique I knew from a snapshot taken when he was 18 and pasted by my mother into the family photo album, alongside the only other photograph surviving from his youth. A picture of him at the age of 6 standing next to Uncle Monty, 3 years older and close to 1.5 feet taller. 2 ragtag kids, stiffly posing in their ancient overalls and their dirty shirts and with their caps pushed back just far enough to reveal the cruelty of their haircuts. In that sepia photo of him at 18, he's already 1,000,000 miles from childhood, a full-fledged force of nature, standing cross-armed in his bathing suit on the sunny beach at Spring Lake, New Jersey, the immovable keystone at the base of a human pyramid of 6 raffish hotel waiters enjoying their afternoon off. As evidenced in that 1919 photo, he'd been powerful through the chest right from the start, and the yoke-bearing shoulders and brawny arms that he had somehow retained even through his years knocking on doors for metropolitan life, so that now at 41, after having worked hauling heavy crates and lifting 100-pound sacks 6 nights a week all through September, there was probably more explosive strength stored up in that body than ever before in his life. Prior to that night, it would have been as impossible for me to envision him beating somebody up, let alone battering bloody his beloved older brother's fatherless son, as to imagine him atop my mother, especially as there was no taboo stronger among Jews with our impoverished European origins and our tenaciously held American ambitions than the pervasive unwritten prohibition against settling disputes by force. In that era, the common Jewish propensity was by and large nonviolent as well as non-alcoholic, a virtue whose shortcoming was the failure to educate the bulk of the young of my generation in the combative aggression that was the first law of other ethnic educations, and indisputably of great practical value when you couldn't negotiate your way out of violence or manage to run away. Among, say, the several hundred boys in my elementary school, between the ages of 5 and 14, who were not chromosomally preordained to be top-flight lightweights like Allie Stoltz, or successful racketeers like Longy Swillman, surely far fewer fistfights broke out than in any of the other neighborhood schools in industrial Newark, where the ethical obligations of a child were differently defined, and schoolmates demonstrated their belligerence by means not readily available to us. So then, for every reason imaginable, it was a devastating night. I didn't have the capacity in 1942 to begin to decipher all the awful implications, but just the sight of my father's and Alvin's blood was stunning enough. Blood spattered the length and breadth of our imitation Oriental rug. Blood dripping from the splintered remains of our coffee table. Blood smeared like a sign across my father's forehead. Blood spurting from my cousin's nose, and the two of them not so much fist-fighting, not so much wrestling as caroming, with a terrible bony thwack colliding, rearing back and charging in like men with antlers branching from their brows. Fantastical cross-species creatures sprung from mythology into our living room and pulping each other's flesh with their massive, snaggle-tooth horns. Inside a house, you usually scale down your movements. You scale down your speed, but here, the scale of things was reversed and terrifying to behold. The South Boston riots, the Detroit riots, the Louisville assassination, the Cincinnati firebombing, the mayhem in St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Akron, Youngstown, Peoria, Scranton, Syracuse, and now this? In an ordinary family living room? Traditionally the staging area for the collective effort to hold the line against the intrusions of a hostile world? The anti-Semites were about to be abetted in their exhilarating solution to America's worst problem by our taking up the cudgels and hysterically destroying ourselves. The horror ended with Mr. Kakuza in his nightshirt and his nightcap, attire I'd never before seen on anyone, man or boy, other than in a funny movie, crashing into our flat with his pistol drawn. A frantic wail rose from Joey's old-world grandmother, appropriately swathed like the Calabrian queen of the shades at the foot of our landing, and from within our own flat came a noise equally hair-raising, the instant the splintered back door flew open and my mother saw that the night-shirted intruder was armed. Minna began bringing up into her hands everything she just swallowed at dinner. I couldn't help myself and promptly urinated, while Sandy, who alone among us was able to find the right words and the vocal strength to utter them, cried, "Don't shoot! It's Alvin!" But Mr. Kakuza was a professional guardian of private property, trained to act now and draw distinctions later, and, without pausing to ask, "Who's Alvin?" immobilized my father's assailant in a strangulating half-Nelson with one arm while holding the pistol to his head with the hand of the other. Alvin's prosthesis had cracked in two. His stump was torn to shreds, and one of his wrists was broken. 3 of my father's front teeth were shattered, 2 ribs were fractured, a gash was opened along his right cheekbone that had to be sutured with almost twice as many stitches as were needed to close the wound inflicted on me by the orphanage horse, and his neck was so badly wrenched that he had to go around in a high steel collar for months afterward. The glass-topped coffee table with the dark mahogany frame that my mother had saved over the years to buy at BAM's, and where, at the conclusion of a pleasant hour of evening reading, she would set down, with its ripping bookmark in place, the new novel by Pearl Buck or Fannie Hurst or Edna Ferber, borrowed from the local pharmacy's tiny rental library, lay in fragments all across the room, and microscopic crumbs of glass were embedded in my father's hands. The rug, the walls, and the furniture were speckled with chocolate icing, from the slices of layer cake they had been eating when they sat down over dessert to talk together in the living room, as well as with their blood, and then there was the smell of it, the airless, gag-inducing slaughterhouse smell.
This ends Disc 9.